The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's cardiac unit hummed their monotonous rhythm as Brooke Sullivan checked Admiral James Kessler's vitals at 0600 hours. Her movements were precise, economical, the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory built over 2 decades of crisis. The antiseptic smell mixed with something else this morning, coffee gone cold in abandoned cups from the night shift, and underneath that, the faint metallic tang of saline solution used on the arterial lines. She documented observations in careful longhand, her penmanship flawless, each notation a small act of control in a world that had already taken so much from her. The Admiral slept fitfully in room 412, his chest rising and falling beneath the cardiac monitor leads, unaware that his former medevac commander now stood across his room tracking his EKG rhythm like a sentinel. She'd recognized his name the moment it appeared on her assignment sheet: James Kessler, Rear Admiral, United States Navy. Classified protocols. Security hold. The chart had come with a seal that meant questions weren't welcome. She hadn't flinched when she read it. She'd simply closed her eyes for 3 seconds in the supply closet, one hand pressed against the carbon fiber beneath her left scrub leg, and then she'd opened them again and moved to the next task. In her locker downstairs, folded beneath her spare scrubs and tucked behind her second pair of compression socks, sat a triangle of fabric the size of a clenched fist. White, navy blue, red. Derek's flag. The Navy Cross had arrived 3 weeks later, the medal in a rosewood case with his name engraved on the base: Lieutenant Derek Sullivan, medevac pilot, killed in action, Baghdad, Iraq, 2019. She hadn't opened the case in 2 years. She'd only opened her locker to stare at the folded flag and remember that the man sleeping in room 412 had been the one holding Derek when the mortar round found their position at 02 for 7 hours on a Tuesday that had somehow lasted the rest of her life. She'd been Captain Sullivan then, Valkyrie to the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines she'd worked with. 12 years of service. 3 tours through the Sunny Triangle. 2 Purple Hearts. She'd held field hospitals together under fire that came in waves, her hand steady on compression bandages while rounds punched through corrugated metal walls and turned everything red. She'd saved people who'd never know her name. She'd lost her son while she was 200 miles away at a hospital in Ballard, the news arriving by encrypted phone call at 0300 hours while she'd been elbow deep in a chest wound that wouldn't stop bleeding no matter what she did. Brooke walked the corridor at 0615, moving toward the central station where charts were stacked and waiting. Her gait was steady, but the left side of her body moved with a fractional delay that only someone trained to notice would catch. The prosthetics beneath her scrubs were engineering-grade, carbon fiber composite with titanium ankle joints, custom-fitted and expensive beyond measure, paid for by a Department of Veterans Affairs that had asked very few questions and a private military contractor who'd asked none at all. She moved well enough that most people saw only a woman with perhaps a slight preference for her right side. She moved well enough that no one asked. She moved well enough that she could stand for 60 hours if necessary, her hand staying steady, her mind compartmentalized into the work that was in front of her. Dr. Pierce arrived at 06 for 5 hours. His shoes clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm that announced him before his face appeared at the corner of the hallway. Expensive shoes. Italian leather. The kind that cost more than Brooke's first month's rent. His white coat was pressed sharp enough to draw blood, no coffee stains, no wrinkles, nothing that suggested he'd actually worked through a night shift. He was a day person. Rounds, consultations, the visible labor of medicine performed for an audience. He did not work the codes at 0300 hours when there was no one watching and the only reward was keeping someone alive. He stopped at her charting station without permission, reading over her left shoulder at her notes on the Admiral's morning assessment. His presence felt like a shadow falling across her work. She did not look up. She continued writing, 0600 vital signs, BP 1 2478, HR 68, O2 sat 98% on room air, respiration 16 steady and unlabored. Cardiac monitor, normal sinus rhythm. Alert and oriented, patient reports no chest pain, no dyspnea. Denies night sweats. Pierce made a small disapproving sound in his throat. Not words. Just a sound, The kind a doctor makes when he's already decided he dislikes what he's seeing but hasn't yet committed to an insult. Captain Sullivan's badge read only B. Sullivan, RN, beneath the hospital logo. She'd worn it that way for 6 months, ever since she'd taken the position under a recommendation from a Navy medical officer whose name she wasn't allowed to discuss. The badge gave nothing away. The uniform hid everything. "You're assigned to 4 today," Pierce said. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant. "Kessler in for 12, which you already have. Add 505, 506, and 418. Brooke nodded once. For patients in critical care was a stretch. Normally the ratio was 3 maximum, sometimes 2 depending on acuity. Adding 3 patients to an already assigned charge patient in a single shift, without explanation, without apology, was what doctors who wanted to prove a point did. She did not argue. Arguing would draw attention. Attention would ask questions. Questions would require answers that she was not permitted to give. Pierce lingered. He was reading her charting more carefully now, his eyes moving across her documentation with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific. Looking for mistakes. Looking for incompetence. Looking for a reason to be right about whatever prejudgment he'd already made about the quiet nurse with the slight limp who moved through his ward without asking permission to exist in it. "You know," Pierce said, his voice carrying toward the 3 residents standing at the medication cabinet 15 feet away, "we've found that nurses with certain physical limitations often compensate with excessive documentation. As if they're trying to prove competence through paper." He paused. "It's not the same as being able to move with proper efficiency through a critical care environment." The residents glanced over. Brooke saw them register the comment, saw the small smiles form at the corners of their mouths. The kind of smiles that said they were already deciding what they believed about the woman at the station. Physical limitations. That was what he'd said. Physical limitations, as if her body were the problem and not the precision of her work or the steadiness of her hands or the fact that she'd been keeping people alive since before these residents had learned to tie their shoes. She did not look up. She signed her name at the bottom of the Admiral's chart with the same careful penmanship she'd used for the rest of the documentation. B. Sullivan, RN. The abbreviation was accurate. The implications were intentional. Everyone here believed she was exactly what she appeared to be, just a nurse, competent enough to follow orders, skilled enough to take vital signs and change dressings, but not important enough to warrant deeper consideration. By 0900 hours, Brooke had reviewed all for patients' medication charts. She'd cross-referenced their conditions against the orders written by Dr. Pierce. 3 of them checked out clean, reasonable dosages, appropriate medications, nothing that set off the alarms that ran through her medical training. But the Admiral's chart showed a propranolol order that didn't match his current heart rate. The dose was precise and exact, 40 milligrams, twice daily. For a man whose cardiac monitor showed sinus rhythm in the low 60s already. For a man whose blood pressure was well controlled. For a man who'd been clear from his admission paperwork that he had a documented sensitivity to beta blockers that had caused syncope 3 years prior during a routine physical. She pulled his full chart. Looked at the admission notes from 3 days ago. There it was, previous adverse reaction to propranolol, patient experienced syncope with HR drop to 38 BPM. Beta blockers noted as contraindicated until cardiology reassessment. She read it twice. 3 times. She checked the orders again, comparing Pierce's handwriting to the rest of the chart. The handwriting matched. The order was recent, written at 0530 this morning, marked stat, flagged as new. The medication hadn't been administered yet because the shift hadn't yet distributed the morning medications. The window was small. 30 minutes, maybe less, before the 1,000-hour med pass would begin and the order would be fulfilled and the medication would go into the Admiral's for line and his heart rate would drop further and his blood pressure would fall and a man who'd been breathing fine at 0600 would become unstable for reasons that would trace back only to the orders he'd been given. Brooke did not feel anger. Anger was a luxury that clouds judgment. Instead, she felt something colder and more useful, clarity. The kind of clarity that came from having seen what happens when systems fail and people die as a result. She pulled up the medication order on the computer terminal and cross-referenced it against the pharmacy database. Pierce's name. Pierce's login. Pierce's order, written alone at 0530, during a time when there would be no witnesses and no one to question why a doctor was ordering a contraindicated medication for a patient with a documented adverse reaction. She closed the file. She turned from her station. She walked across the cardiac unit with the same steady, economical pace she used for everything else. Pierce was standing at the central desk, reviewing something on his computer, his back to her. She spoke quietly enough that only he would hear, her voice measured and calm. Your propranolol order for Admiral Kessler. It conflicts with his documented beta-blocker sensitivity. Pierce turned. He was still wearing the expression of someone supremely confident in his own authority, someone who had never been challenged successfully before and therefore could not imagine being challenged successfully now. His eyes moved from her face downward, taking in her frame, her stance, the slight way her weight favored her right side. She watched him make the calculation. Watched him decide that what stood in front of him was not a problem he needed to take seriously. He leaned close. Not quite touching, but closer than professional distance allowed. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. Close enough that she could feel the small puff of air from his mouth when he spoke. You're questioning my medical judgment? That's interesting. You know, I could have hospital security escort you out of here in under 3 minutes. I have the authority. I have the documentation. One phone call and you're done. No reference, no recommendation letter, nothing but a file note that says you exceeded your scope of practice and had to be removed. He paused. His smile was very small. Don't make me do that. It was not a request. It was a threat delivered in tones that made the 3 residents at the medication cabinet studiously avoid looking in their direction, as if by not witnessing the moment, it might not be happening. The room went quiet in that particular way that indicates everyone present is listening while pretending they aren't. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder. Brooke did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. She did not tremble or flush or show anything that resembled fear. What she showed instead was something colder. Something that came from a place deeper than any defense mechanism her civilian job could offer. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The difference between you and me, Doctor, she said, her voice pitched low enough that only Pierce could hear, is I've actually had to keep someone alive when it mattered. When there were no supervisors to call and no hospital administration to hide behind and no white coat that meant anything because you're covered in blood and your patient is hemorrhaging and the only thing between them and death is your hands and your training and your willingness to do what needs to be done without asking permission. She let the sentence finish. Let it settle. Watched the color begin to rise in his face. Then she turned and walked away, her pace unchanged, her movement steady, her prosthetic legs carrying her back to the medication station where the 1,000-hour pass was beginning to be organized. Tuesday morning at St. Michael's, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and the particular staleness that comes from recirculated air moving through a hospital at dawn. Brooke finished her medication pass by 0900, her prosthetic legs carrying her with the kind of precision that came from training your body to move like equipment, reliable, efficient, incapable of drawing attention. The 1,000-hour Grand Rounds gathering was already assembling at the nurses' station. 8 residents clustered around the central desk, their white coats still crisp, their eyes still carrying that mixture of ambition and exhaustion that came with internship. Dr. Pierce stood at the center like a conductor before an orchestra, his own coat tailored and pressed, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light in exactly the way expensive grooming intended. Sullivan, perfect timing, Pierce called, his voice carrying across the unit with the precision of a man who'd learned long ago that volume was a tool of authority. Let's use your charting as our teaching example this morning. A practical demonstration of common documentation errors. He didn't smile when he said it, but something in the way his jaw moved suggested he was enjoying himself the way a predator enjoys the moment before the strike. He gestured to the monitor mounted above the desk. One of the residents pulled up Brooke's notes from the Admiral's chart, 48 hours of meticulous documentation, every vital sign recorded, every observation marked with military precision. Pierce began circling her entries in red marker, the digital pen moving across the screen like a surgeon marking incision lines. "Notice this notation," he said, his tone shifting into the professorial voice he reserved for teaching moments that were actually performances. "Patient appears anxious about medication regimen. Are we psychiatrists now? Are we suddenly qualified to diagnose emotional states?" One of the residents, a young woman named Chen who Brooke had helped with foreplacement last month, let out a nervous laugh that sounded like permission for the others to follow. This kind of overreach is what happens when nurses forget their place in the hierarchy of care. When they start believing their nursing journal subscriptions qualify them to second-guess physicians. Brooke stood 3 feet away from the group, her body absolutely still, her hands loose at her sides in that military at-ease position she'd never quite trained out of herself. Her eyes tracked Pierce the way a security camera tracks a room, present, recording, emotionally absent. The other nurses at the station had already begun to drift, creating a subtle buffer zone between themselves and the spectacle. She noticed. She noticed everything. That was the burden of having survived Baghdad under mortar fire. You learn to read rooms the way meteorologists read weather patterns. This storm had Pierce's name on it. And here, Pierce continued, zooming into her charting again, she's documented a concern about the Admiral's current medication regimen. Nancy Nightingale playing Florence Nightingale again. The nickname landed exactly where he intended it to land, casual enough to seem like humor, venomous enough to draw another nervous laugh from the residents. He was watching her face now, watching for the flinch, the color rise, the tremor in her hands that would confirm she was breakable. He was watching a woman he'd already decided was beneath him begin to crack under the weight of his contempt. Her face didn't change. Her hands didn't move. The only thing that altered was her eyes. They seemed to look through him to something far more dangerous standing behind him, something ancient and patient and far too cold to care about rank or credentials or the institutional weight he wielded like a weapon. For a moment, Pierce's momentum faltered. Then he recovered, turning back to the residents with a forced brightness that suggested he'd simply decided her non-reaction was evidence of her incompetence rather than evidence of something else entirely. "You see, gentlemen, this is what happens when clinical judgment gets confused with emotional intuition. When nursing becomes therapy instead of precision care." He spoke for another 4 minutes, dissecting each notation, each observation, each moment where Brooke had dared to notice something her physician had missed. By the time grand rounds moved on to the next patient, the damage was architectural, subtle enough to seem professional, thorough enough that every resident in that room had absorbed the message Pierce was broadcasting. The competence you're witnessing isn't genuine skill, it's performance. It's a nurse overstepping. It's exactly what to avoid when you become doctors. Brooke returned to the medication station and began organizing the 1,000-hour pass with the same methodical attention she'd brought to every task since she'd walked through St. Michael's doors. The ritual of work was its own kind of armor. Count. Check. Verify. Document. The human mind could only hold so much anger before the body demanded something else, and she'd learned long ago to let the body win those arguments. To let muscle memory take over. Thursday afternoon arrived with the particular heaviness of midweek fatigue. The break room held a vending machine that dispensed coffee the temperature of asphalt and snacks that had been sitting in their plastic prison since the previous shift. Brooke approached it at 1,445 hours, her break window scheduled between the Admiral's medication management and the post-lunch vital signs. 2 nurses stood at the machine ahead of her, Sarah Holloway and Michelle Chen, both of whom Brooke had covered shifts for last month when Sarah's daughter had the flu and Michelle's mother had fallen. Both of whom she'd helped with difficult patients, complicated transfers, the 1,000 small kindnesses that accumulate in hospital work like compound interest. "Did you hear what happened in grand rounds?" Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular tone of people who think they're being quiet when they're actually broadcasting. She actually challenged Pierce on the Admiral's medication. In front of the patient's family. Michelle turned to face the vending machine, her body language suddenly rigid, suddenly closed. Some people get a couple of certifications and think they're running the place. Think reading a few journals makes them better than physicians who went to medical school. Security should have escorted her out when she disrespected him like that, Sarah added. That's the problem with nursing today. Nobody remembers their place anymore. Brooke reached past them to insert her dollar bill into the machine slot. The mechanical grinding of the selection mechanism was the loudest sound in the room. She pressed C7 without changing her expression, and the machine dispensed her coffee into the paper cup with the sound of something ending, quiet, inevitable, final. Neither Sarah nor Michelle turned to acknowledge her. Neither looked at her. The vending machine finished its cycle and fell silent. Have a good afternoon, Brooke said, her voice perfectly modulated, perfectly professional, perfectly devoid of the 17 years of service in a war zone that had taught her to recognize betrayal at 40 paces. She held the door open for them as she left. The courtesy felt like something she was doing for herself rather than for them. By Friday morning, Dr. Pierce had already begun constructing his official narrative. The medication order he'd written for the Admiral had been revised overnight. The carvedilol dosage remained elevated, sitting at 50 mg twice daily for a patient whose weight and cardiac history recommended 30 mg maximum. Brooke discovered it during her 0730 medication verification, the prescription order illuminating on her screen like a warning light nobody else seemed to be reading. The dosage was 40% higher than cardiac protocol allowed for his presentation. The dosage was dangerous. She found Pierce in the medication room at 08 for 7 hours. The space was narrow, lined with shelves of drugs in amber bottles and 4 solutions in clear plastic bags. The lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving. The air smelled like rubber gloves and hand sanitizer and something else, the particular scent of institutional power meeting resistance. Doctor, I'd like to clarify the Admiral's carvedilol order, Brooke said, her voice pitched low, her phrasing careful. Professional deference wrapped around a genuine concern for a patient's safety. 50 mg twice daily seems outside the recommended dosage for his weight and cardiac history. I wanted to verify with you before the 0900 administration. Pierce was holding a stack of charts. He didn't set them down. He turned slowly, his face assuming an expression of exaggerated patience, the kind a parent uses with a small child asking questions about things beyond their comprehension. Listen very carefully, Nancy, he said, stepping closer until the space between them narrowed to something deliberately invasive. His voice dropped, not from anger but from something far more calculated. From absolute certainty in his own position. I have the cardiac director on speed dial. I have documentation from 23 years of practice. And I have the administrative authority to make clinical decisions based on my judgment, not yours. Security can have you escorted from this building in under 3 minutes. Your nursing license, your entire little career, your residency sponsorship if you think you're applying anywhere, it would be gone. Do we understand each other? He was close enough that she could see the veins standing out in his neck, the pupils dilated beyond what the medication room's lighting should have caused. He was close enough that she could have hurt him. That was the moment that required discipline, not the public humiliation, not the casual cruelty, but this moment, right here, where the only thing between his current physical safety and the sudden application of combat training was a choice. Brooke let him finish. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She simply waited until his breathing had settled slightly, until he'd convinced himself that his intimidation had worked, until the satisfaction of being obeyed began to bloom across his face. Then she spoke. Her voice came out like a blade being drawn from a sheath, quiet, precise, carrying the weight of something honed through years of decisions that mattered far more than hospital politics. The difference between you and me, doctor, is I've actually had to keep someone alive when it mattered. She turned with military precision, the kind of movement that came from hundreds of hours of tactical training, from years of moving through spaces where hesitation was lethal. She walked out of the medication room with her prosthetic legs carrying her with absolute certainty, her pace unchanged, her spine perfectly straight. The controlled fury that radiated from her wasn't the heat of anger, it was something colder, something that moved like winter into the spaces she'd occupied. Behind her, Pierce stood frozen in the fluorescent light, his hand still holding his charts, his face beginning to purple with the particular rage that comes from understanding that your threat has landed on someone who fundamentally does not fear you. The summons came at 7:43 a.m., before the morning briefing. Not a request. A command. The nurse manager, Patricia Chen, waited in her office with the door closed, and Brooke knew before entering that something had fundamentally shifted. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead. Patricia sat behind her desk, her hands folded on top of a stack of documents that looked thick enough to condemn someone. "Brooke, please sit." Not her name used casually. The formal structure of a procedure being initiated. Brooke didn't sit. Her hands remained at her sides, posture military straight, the kind of stillness that came from 100 situations where moving wrong meant dying. She had learned long ago that sitting during these conversations placed you at a disadvantage. Vulnerable. Trapped. Dr. Pierce has filed 3 separate incident reports, Patricia began, reading from the papers. The first documents your response to his medication order as insubordinate. The second claims you performed an unauthorized procedure on the Admiral without physician consultation. The third suggests a pattern of exceeding your scope of practice and potentially falsifying documentation. Patricia's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reading charges. She wasn't angry. She was procedural. Which was somehow worse. Anger had passion. Procedure had momentum. Brooke's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The kind of micro-expression that meant nothing to civilians, everything to people who had learned to read faces in rooms where a single misread meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a flag. "That's not accurate," Brooke said. Each word clipped, precise. No elaboration. No defense. The voice that had commanded medevac teams through mortar fire was still there, buried under months of deferential civilian speech. It wanted out. Patricia continued as if Brooke hadn't spoken. Additionally, Dr. Pierce contacted the state nursing board president directly at her home last night. He expressed serious concerns about your credentials and your clinical judgment. As of 30 minutes ago, your nursing license has been placed on immediate administrative suspension pending a full investigation by the board. The words landed like shrapnel. Not surprising, Brooke had seen the angle the moment Pierce started documenting everything, but knowing something was coming and surviving it landing on you were two different things. The suspension meant no patient contact. No Admiral. No mission. No final service to Derek's memory. The Admiral was vulnerable now, exposed, with only Pierce's people around him. The people Pierce had hand-selected. The people who might not recognize danger until it was too late. Your badge is deactivated effective immediately, Patricia said. You're on paid administrative leave until the investigation concludes. That process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks, but given the severity of the allegations, it could extend beyond that. Brooke's hands were steady. They had held worse. They had held her son's commanding officer as the man wept over Derek's body in a forward operating base in Fallujah. They had held the folded flag that came home instead of Derek. They had held the Admiral's hand when he first arrived at St. Michael's, when his eyes had recognized her, when he'd started to speak and she'd shaken her head once, sharply, a silent command, don't. Don't acknowledge. Not yet. Not ever. There's more, Patricia said, and Brooke heard the apology in her voice now. Patricia didn't believe this. But belief didn't matter when the paperwork was this thick, when the state board was involved, when a senior physician had spent hours building a narrative with the precision of someone who had practiced the destruction many times before. Karen Webb's been reassigned to the orthopedics unit. The schedule for Admiral Kessler's care has been reorganized. Going forward, the nursing team will consist of staff selected by Dr. Pierce's office. There it was. The real move. Not Brooke's suspension, that was the cover story, the bureaucratic weapon, the way to remove her from the field without creating an external threat. The real move was removing the only witness to Brooke's clinical competence, the only person who had seen her correct a dangerous medication order and save the Admiral's life before anything officially happened. Karen Webb was gone. The night shift was gone. The Admiral was alone. Brooke's breathing remained even. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The same rhythm she'd used in Baghdad when the C-130 took fire, when the patient coded on the ramp, when the world compressed into nothing but the next breath and the next procedure. "I need your badge," Patricia said quietly. "And your hospital ID. You're not to enter any patient care areas. Security has been notified. Your access is locked as of now." Brooke removed her badge from around her neck. The plastic was warm from her body heat. She set it on Patricia's desk with the kind of care you might use with a loaded weapon, which it was. The badge was her access. Without it, she was just another civilian in the hallways. She turned and walked out of the office without speaking. Behind her, Patricia's voice followed, "Brooke, if you need anything during this process," but Brooke was already moving down the corridor, her pace controlled, her shoulders level, her face a photograph of someone processing routine news. That was the trick. That was what separated soldiers from civilians. Civilians reacted. Soldiers executed the next step in the plan, because there was always a next step, because showing weakness was a luxury you couldn't afford when people were counting on you. The parking lot was grey. Early November in Norfolk meant the sky had collapsed into that particular shade of hopelessness that came before winter. Brooke sat in her car for 43 minutes with the engine off, staring through the windshield at nothing. Her phone vibrated twice. She didn't check it. One of those notifications was definitely from her handler, the military liaison who had orchestrated her placement at St. Michael's, who had activated her for this mission specifically because the Admiral had been Derek's commanding officer, because some debts didn't have statutes of limitations, because the Navy didn't abandon its own. Not officially. Not in the ways that mattered. But even the Navy couldn't protect you when the threat came from inside. At 3:17 a.m., Brooke sat in the corner booth of the Starlight Cafe on Granby Street, the kind of place that existed in the spaces between lives, where the fluorescent lights had been installed in 1987 and never replaced, where the vinyl seats were cracked and repaired with duct tape the color of old blood, where the coffee never quite tasted like coffee anymore but something closer to the memory of coffee. The waitress, a woman whose name tag read Dottie and whose eyes had seen enough human wreckage to recognize one more, refilled the cup without asking. Brooke hadn't ordered anything beyond the first coffee. She was just occupying space, the way soldiers did when the mission parameters had shifted and you were waiting for new orders that might never come. Her reflection in the dark window glass looked hollow. Not frightened, her training had purged her of that luxury years ago, in a medevac bird over Anbar province when the hydraulics failed and you had 90 seconds to get everyone off before the aircraft hit a cantaloupe field. But hollow. Like someone looking at herself from a very great distance, across a gulf of years and lives and sacrifices that had seemed to matter once but maybe never had, not really, not in the way that actually changed outcomes. The Admiral was alone now. Pierce's people surrounded him, people who took direction without question, people who had learned that following orders was safer than thinking. In the morning, the Admiral would wake in a hospital room where his protection officer had been moved to a different unit, where the one nurse who understood what was happening to him had been administratively erased, where the subtle threat that had been targeting him for months could complete itself without witnesses, without documentation, without anyone to pull the red cord. And Brooke would be 60 miles away, on paid administrative leave, watching her nursing license evaporate, knowing that the only way to protect her mission was to stay silent, because opening her mouth meant revealing everything, that she was former military, that she had combat training, that she had known the Admiral before, that the entire civilian cover story would detonate and take her handler, her clearance, and the Admiral's security detail with it. She raised the coffee cup to her lips. It was cold now. The ceramic chipped where her mouth met it. Outside the window, Norfolk slept. The rain had started sometime around midnight, not dramatic but steady, the kind of rain that would last until morning and then beyond that, settling into the city like a judgment that no one had fought hard enough to prevent. A truck passed on Granby Street, its headlights cutting through the darkness for a moment before leaving Brooke in shadow again. The folded flag was in her locker at home, still in its presentation box, still the way it had come from Dover Air Force Base. Derek's flag. The flag that represented everything she had failed to protect, everyone she had been too late to save, every moment of her career that had been measured in loss and compromise, and the particular pain that came from being good at what you did and discovering that it didn't matter, because the world was bigger than competence, because evil was systematic and slow and patient and wore a white coat and had access to a pharmacy and didn't need to raise his voice to dismantle you. She had come to St. Michael's to protect the Admiral. To honor Derek's memory by saving the man who had held her son as he died. To complete one last mission before she hung up everything that remained of Captain Sullivan and became only Brooke, the nurse with the prosthetic limbs and the empty medical record and the secret that would destroy careers if spoken aloud. Instead, she had failed both. The waitress set the check down without being asked. $12.60 for coffee Brooke hadn't finished. She left cash on the table and walked out into the rain, moving toward the parking lot where her car waited, where the interior was cold and empty and exactly like the inside of her own head, where there were no answers, only the sound of rain on the windshield and the certainty that dawn was coming whether she was ready for it or not. Her phone buzzed at 3:24 a.m. Not her hospital phone. Her personal device, the encrypted line Naval Intelligence had activated without her knowledge, the one she'd discovered buried in her apartment's kitchen drawer alongside a note signed only with a call sign she'd thought died in Baghdad. The Admiral's heart monitor data, feeding directly to her screen. Real-time telemetry from a man she'd sworn to protect. The rhythm on her phone was wrong. Atrial fibrillation sliding toward ventricular tachycardia. 72 hours into her suspension, and his cardiac output was collapsing. She was 7 minutes from St. Michael's. She ran 2 red lights. The night security guard at the ER entrance recognized her face but not her authority. "Your badge is deactivated, Brooke." He reached for her arm. She didn't break stride. "Admiral Kessler, cardiac unit, code status. Move." Not a request. It wasn't even her voice anymore, it was the voice of someone who'd issued commands in hospital tents while mortars shook the walls. The guard stepped aside. The cardiac unit was already in chaos when she burst through the sealed doors. Code blue alarms shrieked like wounded animals. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. And there was Pierce, performing chest compressions with the jerky panic of someone who'd learned CPR in a weekend course and never faced actual cardiac arrest. "You can't be here." Pierce looked up, recognition and fury flashing across his face simultaneously. But Brooke was already moving. She planted her hands on his shoulders and pulled him back from the bedside with the mechanical precision of someone whose leg muscles had been rebuilt in a military hospital. "Move." She was already counting compressions before he'd stepped away. 1, 2, 3, her hands pressed down with the rhythm of muscle memory, of 1,000 hours in field hospitals where the difference between a beating heart and a flat line was the space between living and dying. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The ventilator took over the breathing while she focused on keeping his cardiovascular system from collapsing entirely. The Admiral's eyes fluttered open during a pause. Not supposed to happen. Open eyes meant consciousness meant complications. But his lips moved, and Brooke leaned close, her ear near his mouth, and he whispered a single word so quietly only she could hear it. "Valkyrie." The room stopped. A Marine in civilian clothes stepped forward, the liaison who'd been standing guard in the corner, the one who'd watched her for 3 months without ever identifying himself. But now he was moving into dress blues that seemed to materialize from nowhere, his voice carrying the weight of parade ground authority. "Captain Brooke Sullivan, call sign Valkyrie, Navy Cross for heroism in Baghdad when she held a field hospital under mortar fire for 6 hours, saving 17 lives including." "This is identity fraud." Pierce's face had gone from pale to purple, spit flying from his lips as he waved papers, printouts, screenshots, fabricated documents. "I contacted the VA records office. These are proof of falsified nursing credentials, her entire background is fabricated. I'm having her arrested for." 2 FBI agents stepped from the corridor in dark suits, badges already visible. The lead agent, Special Agent Diaz, spoke almost gently. "Dr. Pierce, we've been monitoring your communications for 6 weeks as part of a joint investigation with Naval Intelligence. You've been altering medical records to cover medication errors that nearly killed Admiral Kessler twice. Once with the beta-blocker overdose you ordered. Once by restricting qualified personnel during a critical window. Pierce's face went from purple to the white of someone watching his career evaporate in real time. I was protecting patient care from unauthorized, his voice cracked. The second agent produced a tablet showing intercepted emails, altered digital charts spanning months, phone records with timestamps. You also accepted payment from a foreign national to ensure the Admiral's care complications. That's conspiracy to commit murder of a flag officer. The cardiac unit fell into absolute silence except for the Admiral's steady heart monitor beep. Sinus rhythm. 102 beats per minute. Climbing back toward normal. The Marine liaison continued as if Pierce had already ceased to exist. A Navy captain in dress whites entered from the elevator, Commander Sarah Park, Pentagon Medical Affairs, her uniform carrying the kind of authority that comes from for deployments and a desk on the E-ring. Park moved directly to Brooke's side and saluted her actual decorations. Not a casual gesture. A full military salute, fist to chest, the kind that meant respect was being paid to equal rank. Task Force Sabre, Joint Special Operations Command, Admiral Kessler said from the bed, his voice hoarse but clear. Every resident within earshot pulled out their phones simultaneously. JSOC doesn't officially exist, but everyone knows what it means when that unit gets named aloud in a hospital. A woman in civilian clothes stepped forward, Naval Intelligence Officer Rachel Torres, displaying actual citation documents on a tablet. Photos followed. A younger Brooke covered in blood and dust, performing a surgical procedure under combat conditions. Her hand steady as a surgical laser even as concrete dust fell from the ceiling above her. The Marine liaison delivered the next layer. Admiral Kessler was the commanding officer of her son, Corporal Derek Sullivan, USMC. He died in Baghdad saving the Admiral's convoy. The Admiral personally carried her son's body to the medevac. Brooke's face remained controlled, but her hand unconsciously moved to the locker key still hanging beneath her scrubs. The one that held the folded flag. Derek's flag. Commander Park's voice softened slightly, but not much. Captain Sullivan volunteered for this monitoring assignment under Operation Safeguard. Her nursing credentials are genuine, obtained after her medical retirement following catastrophic injuries sustained when she threw herself on a secondary IED to shield 2 wounded Marines. She lost both legs below the knee that day. Dr. Marsh, the resident who'd frozen during the pneumothorax, stared at Brooke's legs with new understanding. The prosthetics had always been there. He'd never seen them. Nobody sees what they don't expect to see. Sarah and Michelle from the vending machine stood motionless, their faces the color of old bone. Park delivered the final layer. This hospital had a security leak. Someone was compromising the Admiral's care. Captain Sullivan's mission was to identify and protect until we could verify the threat and provide remediation. Her eyes moved to Pierce as the FBI agent secured handcuffs around his wrists. Mission accomplished. The agents led Pierce out of the unit. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just walked, his career and his freedom leaving in their wake the kind of silence that comes after truth destroys everything a man built on lies. Brooke stood motionless at the Admiral's bedside, one hand resting on his shoulder. His eyes met hers. He didn't try to speak. Some things don't need words. Commander Park moved toward the cardiac monitors, checking the readout with the clinical eye of someone who'd run field hospitals herself. Rhythm stabilizing. Good work, Captain. Then, to the assembled staff, everyone in this room has signed NDAs. This operation never happened. Admiral Kessler's care continues under standard protocols. Captain Sullivan will resume her nursing duties effective immediately. Any questions? The silence was answer enough. Brooke pulled her locker key from beneath her scrubs and looked at it, the key that had hidden a folded flag for 6 months, a flag that represented the son of an admiral who'd held her son as he died. She'd kept it hidden because showing it would have revealed everything. Now there was nothing left to hide. The room knew. The hospital knew. In 72 hours, everyone would know. She turned to the Admiral. I'm going on break. I need some jello. The Admiral almost smiled. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. 6 months later, Brooke walks the corridors of St. Michael's as though the walls themselves have shifted to make room for her. Her office sits at the end of the trauma wing, the door marked with a nameplate that no longer requires explanation: Captain B. Sullivan, RN, Trauma Protocol Director. On the wall behind her desk, a shadow box holds her bronze stars side by side, their ribbons catching the afternoon light. Below them, a silver star. And centered in the glass, a Navy cross, the weight of her entire military career finally allowed to exist in daylight. The folded flag Derek's CO had pressed into her hands at the funeral sits beneath them, no longer hidden in a locker, no longer compartmentalized from the rest of her life. She's teaching a class on emergency needle decompression when the morning light slants through the hospital's loading dock windows. 12 nurses sit around the simulation table, watching her hands move with the same precision that saved Admiral Kessler's life. Her voice carries the authority of someone who has performed these procedures not in controlled environments, but in the chaos of field hospitals under mortar fire. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she says, her fingers finding the exact anatomical landmark on the plastic chest model. One fluid motion. The hiss of air escaping means you've already saved their life. Everything after that is stabilization. A new resident, Dr. Marsh, the one who froze during the Admiral's code, sits in the front row, filling his notebook with meticulous notes. He hasn't missed a single one of her classes since Pierce was arrested. He's learning that authority isn't something you inherit or buy. It's something you earn in the moments when everything breaks and you don't. After the class ends, Karen Webb waits in the doorway. She's wearing the title of Director of Nursing now, a promotion that came through exactly 1 week after Pierce's license was suspended. She never says it aloud, but the gratitude in her eyes does. Admiral Kessler called, Karen says. He's sending something. Wants you to have it before the end of shift. Brooke nods, already turning back to clean the simulation equipment. She doesn't ask questions. The Admiral has called 3 times in the past 6 months, formal calls, always with the same tone of someone completing an obligation to someone they serve with. Not the other way around. The letter arrives at 1,400 hours. It's in a Pentagon envelope, sealed with the kind of formality reserved for official commendations. Brooke opens it at her desk, reading the Admiral's handwriting, precise, military, economical with words the way only command officers are. Captain Sullivan, it begins. The intelligence you protected has disrupted 3 foreign intelligence networks. 7 operatives are in federal custody. 16 assets have been relocated to safety. Your son's death meant something. Because of you, it continues to mean something. The letter goes on to detail classified operations she cannot discuss, classified victories that will never appear in any newspaper. It ends with a single line: you didn't just save my life. You finished his mission. She reads it once. Then she opens her locker. The folded flag sits in the same place it's always been, but everything about it has changed. The compartmentalization is over. Derek's service and her service exist in the same breath now, no longer separated by scrubs and false identities and the careful performance of being someone smaller than she actually is. She touches the corner of the fabric, and for the first time since she placed it in her locker 7 years ago, she allows herself the thought, Derek would have been proud of her. Not despite the hidden years, but because of them. Because she'd carried his memory through the hardest part, the part where nobody knew what she was actually carrying. At 1,530 hours, she walks through the loading dock on her way to rounds. The medical supply van is parked in the same bay where it always parks on Tuesdays. The man stepping out wears prison work release coveralls, faded grey fabric, the kind that hangs loose on a body that's lost weight through stress and confinement. Dr. Pierce's hands shake as he grabs the first box from the van. His face has changed in 6 months. The expensive haircut is gone, replaced by the institutional buzz cut of someone in the penal system's work release program. His eyes are the color of watered-down regret. Their eyes meet for exactly 2 seconds. Brooke doesn't slow her pace. Doesn't acknowledge him. Doesn't give him the courtesy of her attention. She simply continues toward the cardiac unit with the same quiet competence that has always defined her movement through this hospital. Behind her, she hears the box hit the loading dock with a hollow thud. She hears Pierce's breathing, jagged and uneven. She hears the fluorescent fixtures buzz overhead like insects. She doesn't hear him speak. Some people lose the right to be heard. The FBI had been thorough in their final briefing. 17 altered medical records. $75,000 in cryptocurrency payments from a handler based in Moscow. 6 attempts to manipulate her medical assessments of the Admiral's condition, each one calculated to appear as natural complications, a missed dose, a medication interaction, a dosing error that would have looked like hospital negligence rather than murder. Pierce's strategic competence had been real. His desperation, when finally cornered by federal agents who'd been monitoring his communications for 6 weeks, had been even more real. The state medical board had suspended his license pending criminal trial. His family had stopped answering his calls. The hospital where he'd once moved through corridors like he owned them had become a place where he unloaded supplies while wearing prison-issued clothing. That's the thing about power that's borrowed rather than earned. It evaporates the moment the institution removes its protection. Brooke finishes her rounds at 1800 hours. She checks on Admiral Kessler in the private suite where he's completing his final recovery period before returning to full duty at the Pentagon. His vitals are stable, heart rhythm regular, oxygen saturation perfect, the man who'd been flatlined 6 months ago now reading briefing papers with the focused intensity of someone whose mind is worth protecting. He looks up when she enters, and something like understanding passes between them. Not gratitude exactly. Not quite. More like the recognition that exists only between people who've held the line when the line was fracturing. The letter, Brooke says. Had to be said, the Admiral replies. Derek's work continued through you. That's not poetry. That's fact. She nods once and turns back to the monitors. This is the language they speak, not sentiment, but obligation. Not emotion, but purpose. When she leaves the room, he returns to his briefing papers, and she returns to her charts, and the work continues. At 19:30 hours, a young nurse approaches her locker, Emily, one of the recent hires, barely 25, the kind of young that still comes with uncertainty in her movements. Captain Sullivan, she says, her voice carrying a question. I got a letter from my brother. He's deployed with the Marines. He asked me something I didn't know how to answer, and I thought maybe you could help. Brooke doesn't close her locker immediately. She looks at Emily, really looks at her, and sees the same thing she saw in Dr. Marsh's eyes during those classes. The desire to understand that authority isn't something you're given. It's something you earn through choices that matter. She opens her locker fully. She removes the folded flag and holds it where Emily can see it clearly. What's his name? Brooke asks. Derek. My brother's name is Derek. The coincidence hits like a physical thing, but Brooke's face doesn't change. Her hands don't tremble. She simply holds the flag and begins to speak about a man named Derek Sullivan who died in Baghdad because he understood that some things are worth protecting. She talks about how authority works in those moments, how it's not about rank or credentials or the letters after your name. It's about being someone people can trust to hold the line. She talks about her brother, and she doesn't hide the flag, and she doesn't compartmentalize, and when Emily leaves that locker room, she carries with her the knowledge that somewhere in this hospital works a woman who understands exactly what her brother is doing and why it matters. The last nurse who needs to see Brooke is Sarah. She approaches at the end of shift, when the hospital has that quality of exhaustion that comes from 8 hours of managing human fragility. Sarah was one of the nurses who turned away at the vending machine, the one who'd let Pierce's casual cruelty convince her that Brooke was overstepping, that somehow a decorated military officer in scrubs was somehow threatening her competence rather than revealing what actual competence looked like. Sarah's apology doesn't come in words. It comes in the way she steps aside when Brooke passes, giving full room. It comes in the meeting of eyes that hold genuine respect. Sarah had transferred once before things exploded, but she'd come back after Pierce's arrest, and now she works with a kind of focus that says she understands what she'd almost become and is working not to become it. Brooke catches her at the nurse's station. The training program I'm starting next quarter, Brooke says, I need someone to help coordinate. Someone who understands both the civilian protocols and the realities of what happens when systems fail. Someone good. Sarah's eyes widen. It's not an apology being offered. It's something better, a chance to move forward instead of backward, to be part of something instead of running from it. I'll do it, Sarah says immediately. I'll do it right. By 2200 hours, the hospital has entered that strange nocturnal rhythm where the staff shrinks and the work intensifies. Brooke walks the cardiac unit one final time, checking monitors, confirming that nothing has slipped during the evening shift. Her steps are steady, her limp barely visible to anyone who's not looking for it. The prosthetics she's worn since the IED took her legs have become less a reminder of loss and more simply part of her architecture, the same way scars tell stories, her gait tells stories. She passes the loading dock one more time. The van is gone. Pierce is gone. The shadows in the bay are empty except for the usual arrangement of supplies, the careful stacking of hospital infrastructure. In a few weeks, Pierce will stand before a federal judge. The trial will be brief, the evidence comprehensive. He'll serve somewhere between 8 and 12 years in a federal medical facility where he'll finally understand what it means to be an inmate rather than a provider. His expensive education will mean nothing there. His family connections will mean nothing there. He'll be exactly as powerless as he made Brooke feel, and perhaps in that powerlessness, he'll finally understand what she'd been trying to tell him with her silence, that the difference between them isn't intelligence or training or credentials. It's character. It's the willingness to choose what's right instead of what's advantageous. Brooke returns to her office one last time before leaving shift. She looks at the shadow box on her wall, the decorations, the flag, the physical evidence that Captain Brooke Sullivan exists and always has existed, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. She thinks about Derek, about the moment his CO had placed the folded flag in her hands and said, he was a good man. The best kind of soldier. She'd never told anyone this, but that phrase had sustained her through 7 years of hiding. Not he was proud, not he was honored, not any of the things people usually say about the dead. But he was good. That simple fact, held in a folded flag. She touches the glass of the shadow box, and the weight of 6 months settles into something bearable. The Admiral had said it in his letter, Derek's mission continues. Not symbolically. Actually. 3 foreign intelligence networks disrupted. 7 operatives in federal custody. 16 assets relocated to safety. The work her son started in Baghdad has found completion in Norfolk, through a nurse in scrubs who finally doesn't have to hide her call sign anymore. As she turns off the light in her office, she allows herself one small thing she's never allowed before, she almost smiles. Not quite. Almost. The kind of almost that means everything is finally, carefully, beginning to be all right. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. But perhaps, she thinks, it's also what you do when the world finally starts to see. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this, would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.